Alien princess promised to marry me. 20 years later, she returned. The air in the gardens of New Meridian buzzed with the excitement of a momentous occasion. Banners fluttered in the warm afternoon breeze, their colors vivid against the pale blue sky. The earth felt alive, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Captain Jack Morrison stood straight, his dress uniform snug around his collar, making him feel uncomfortable under the weight of the moment. Today was no ordinary day. This was humanity's first official meeting with the Valerian Empire, and Jack knew that everything had to go right. The Valerian ships, massive and majestic, had arrived 3 days ago. They glided into the atmosphere like floating crystals, their elegance almost otherworldly. Jack had been chosen as part of the diplomatic escort due to his ability to stay calm in tense situations, his quick learning of alien customs, and his reputation as a steady, reliable officer. At only 26, he was one of the youngest officers ever selected for such an important mission. The significance of today wasn't lost on him. But despite his training, something about the whole event felt surreal, as if the quiet calm he projected was a thin mask covering the rising sense of unease that simmered just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the weight of history hanging over him. It was something else. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would mark the beginning of something far bigger than the carefully arranged speeches, the diplomatic handshakes, or the ceremonial toasts. The Valerian delegation descended from their shuttle, and Jack stood at attention as they passed by. Their robes billowed in the breeze, a cascade of shimmering fabric that seemed to shift colors in the light. At the forefront of the procession was the emperor himself, tall and imposing, his skin shimmering like pearl under the sun. He moved with the calm assurance of someone used to power. Behind him were his advisors, military commanders, and his family. But Jack's attention was captured by something else, something unexpected. A small figure at the very back of the group bounced excitedly, her movements full of youthful energy. She couldn't have been older than 8, yet her presence was as commanding as any adult in the procession. Her large violet eyes sparkled with wonder as she took in everything around her, and her silver hair was decorated with tiny glowing ornaments that tinkled softly as she moved. The adults around her, guardians and diplomats alike, maintained a perfect, almost statuesque composure. But the little princess, unburdened by the heavy responsibilities of her royal position, pointed at various things and tugged at her guardian's sleeve, demanding answers to every question that popped into her head. Jack couldn't help but watch her, intrigued by her carefree curiosity. His attention drifted back to the ceremony as speeches began, but his mind wasn't on the formal exchanges. He was too focused on the princess, her innocent joy, her openness to the world. She was so different from the cold, calculated world of diplomacy that he had come to know. But there was something else, something deeper beneath that childlike curiosity, something Jack couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the reception that evening that he had his first real conversation with her. While Jack was reviewing the schedule for the following day, a voice broke through his thoughts. "You're very tall," the little princess said, standing suddenly beside him. Jack looked down, startled. "I suppose I am. You speak English very well, princess." "I've been studying," she replied proudly, her violet eyes bright with excitement. "I learned about Earth and humans and all your different countries. Is it true you have animals called dogs that live in your houses with you?" Jack smiled. "Yes, that's true. Do you have pets on your world?" Her eyes widened. "We have creatures, but none like dogs. They're different. Tell me more." And so began a conversation that would mark the beginning of an unexpected connection. Jack, ever the diplomat, had initially assumed this was just a child's innocent fascination with Earth. But as she spoke, Jack found himself drawn in. Her endless questions about humanity, her joy in learning, and the warmth in her voice made him feel like he was meeting the true heart of the Valerian Empire for the first time. Her name was Lyra, she said, and she was the youngest of the Emperor's children. Diplomacy bored her, she explained, but meeting humans, this was different. "You have so many emotions," she said, and you tell such wonderful stories." Jack laughed softly, charmed by her openness. But little did he know, her innocent curiosity would shape both their futures in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the evening wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's words, her presence, were leading him toward something far bigger, something that had the potential to alter the course of human history. But what exactly was it? Was it just the thrill of meeting an alien species, or was it the beginning of a journey that would lead to far greater things, things Jack never imagined possible? As the night came to a close and Jack returned to his quarters, he couldn't help but think of the little princess and the promise she had unknowingly made. The first seeds of a deep, unpredictable connection had been planted, and as the stars twinkled outside his window, Jack felt a strange unease stir within him. Something was coming, something unexpected, and he wasn't sure if humanity would be ready for it. Part 2. A friendship that could change everything. The days that followed the arrival of the Valerian delegation were filled with the usual diplomatic formalities, handshakes, speeches, and long dinners that Jack had grown accustomed to. Yet, despite the apparent success of the first contact, something nagged at him. The ceremony had ended, and the official part of the visit was over, but Jack found himself thinking constantly about Princess Lyra. Her bright eyes and unrestrained curiosity had caught him off guard in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't until the third day of the diplomatic mission that Jack saw her again. This time, it wasn't in the midst of the grand ceremony or the polished speeches. He had retreated to the quiet gardens of New Meridian, hopping for a moment of peace. He had to ensure everything was perfect for the next round of meetings, but his thoughts were still scattered. As he walked through the flower-filled paths, his mind running over the list of upcoming tasks, a soft voice interrupted his focus. "Do you know," it said, "that there are stories about your kind, about Earth?" Jack turned, surprised to see Princess Lyra standing near a fountain, her silver hair shimmering in the sunlight. She wasn't accompanied by her usual entourage of guards or advisors. The busy air of diplomacy seemed far away as she stood there, alone, her violet eyes shining with unfiltered curiosity. "You found the time to study us, Princess?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. "I have," she replied eagerly, walking over to him. "I've read about your Earth, your countries, your animals. The stories are fascinating. I don't understand everything yet, but I'm learning. You humans are so full of emotions. I think that's why I like talking to you." Jack was taken aback. She had such an openness about her, as if she wasn't burdened by the rules of her royal position. For a moment, it was as if they were simply two curious people, one human, one alien, finding common ground in a world of unfamiliarity. "I've been reading about dogs," she continued, her voice filled with excitement. "Why do you love them so much? You let them sleep in your homes. Do you think that's a good idea?" Jack couldn't help but laugh. "Yes, it's true. We let them in our homes because they're loyal, and they keep us company. They're more than pets, they're family." Lyra's face lit up as if she had just discovered the key to some long-lost mystery. "Family," she echoed softly. "I think I understand." They spent the next hour together, sitting by the fountain, talking about Earth and the strange, wonderful things that made it unique. While diplomats continued their talks and deals in the halls of New Meridian, Jack and Lyra were worlds apart, living in a moment that felt removed from politics and power. At one point, Jack found himself talking about the human need for exploration. "I joined the colonial service because I wanted to see the stars, to meet people from different worlds, to learn what we have in common." Lyra was silent for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. "But, what do you think we have in common, Captain?" Jack looked at her, not sure how to answer. The truth was, he hadn't really thought about it. They came from completely different worlds, different histories, different ways of living. But now, sitting with this young alien princess, something shifted. There was a connection between them, an unspoken understanding. "I think we both want the same thing," he said slowly. to make the universe a little smaller, to connect with others. Lyra smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something deeper than curiosity. Maybe that's why I like you, Captain Jack Morrison. You don't treat me like a child. You treat me like I'm someone worth listening to. Jack felt a warm rush of emotion, something unexpected, something human. In that moment, he realized how much he valued this connection, how much he was learning from Lyra. The simplicity of their conversation, the genuine curiosity, was more meaningful than any political speech he had heard over the past few days. As the sun began to set, and the garden filled with the soft hum of distant voices, Jack knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. This was about understanding, about crossing boundaries that had nothing to do with politics or power. And as they stood up to leave, Lyra looked at him with a quiet intensity. "Maybe one day," she said softly, "we can visit Earth together, see the dogs you love so much." Jack smiled, feeling the weight of their friendship settle in a way he hadn't expected. "Maybe we will, Princess. Maybe we will." But even as he spoke those words, Jack couldn't shake the growing feeling in the pit of his stomach. There was more to Lyra than met the eye, more to her family's politics, and more to the Valyrian Empire's plans than anyone realized. He had a feeling that this fragile bond they were building could soon be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. And so, as they walked back towards the others, the air between them light with newfound understanding, Jack couldn't help but wonder if their friendship was the calm before a storm, one that neither of them were prepared for. Part 3. The Weight of the Past. 20 years had passed since Jack Morrison had met Princess Lyra, and the world had changed in ways he hadn't expected. The youthful idealism he once carried into his mission was long gone, replaced by a seasoned pragmatism born of countless diplomatic failures and hard-learned lessons. In the vast expanse of space, he had witnessed colonies crumble, alliances fracture, and conflicts escalate. The Valyrian Empire, once humanity's most promising ally, had grown cold, distant, and increasingly difficult to understand. Now, as Commander Morrison of the Destiny's Edge, Jack found himself sitting at the center of yet another diplomatic crisis. But this time, it wasn't just the fate of colonies at stake. Something far deeper, far more personal was at play. The memories of that first encounter with the Valyrians had faded into the past. Back then, it had all seemed so simple, one small promise from a young princess, a shared moment of curiosity, a fleeting connection between two species. Jack had assumed that Lyra's innocent declaration, asterisk, "When I grow up, I'll marry you," asterisk, was nothing more than a child's passing fancy. But as the years passed, and his career took him deeper into the complexities of interstellar politics, he could never quite shake the memory of her smile, her voice, and that pendant she had given him. Now, as a seasoned officer, Jack found himself thinking back to the day the Valyrian delegation had left New Meridian. He had kept the crystal pendant she gave him, not out of any romantic attachment, but as a strange memento from a time that felt so far removed from his current reality. The pendant had been tucked away in a small compartment of his locker, buried beneath the piles of reports, mission briefings, and tactical data that filled his daily life. But it wasn't just the pendant that had stayed with him all these years. It was the promise, the one he had dismissed so easily back then. "When I grow up, I'll marry you." Jack had dismissed it, not because he didn't find Lyra fascinating, but because he never believed that childhood promises ever held weight. They were just sweet, naive words spoken in a garden under the warm sun, meant to be forgotten with time. But now, as he reviewed intelligence reports aboard the Destiny's Edge, he realized that the universe had a funny way of making the past resurface when least expected. And with it, the weight of the promises made long ago. As the stars streaked past the ship's observation window, Jack sat in his quarters, holding the pendant once again. The crystal caught the light and cast rainbow patterns across the room, and for a moment he allowed himself to relive that moment. The moment when a little girl had declared with such certainty that she would marry him one day. The reality of that declaration seemed impossible now. Princess Lyra had likely forgotten it long ago, just as he had forgotten many of his own youthful ideals. Or had she? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden communication. Lieutenant Hayes' voice crackled through the intercom. "Commander, we're receiving a request from command. They're asking about the new Meridian incident from 20 years ago, something about reviewing first contact protocols." Jack's chest tightened at the mention of the incident. It had been so long since he'd thought about it. He hadn't realized it would come up again, not in his current position. But there it was, the past resurfacing, pulling him back into a memory he had tried to bury. "Tell them I'll file a report by the end of the week," Jack said, his voice steady, but his mind racing. As he sat back, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of the pendant, Jack couldn't help but wonder, what had become of Lyra? She had been just a child, but her words had always felt different, more profound than those of anyone else he'd met. And now, 20 years later, the same image kept repeating in his mind. That little girl, so sure of herself, offering him a promise she was convinced she would keep. The universe was full of mysteries, and the Valerian Empire, once an ally, was one of its greatest. But as Jack pondered the changes in the political landscape, the shifts in power, and the growing tension between humanity and the Valerians, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's influence, whether intentional or not, was still woven into the fabric of his life. He didn't know it yet, but the past he had tried to bury would soon collide with the present, and the weight of that forgotten promise would become far more than a mere memento. The Valerian Empire was shifting. The galaxy was shifting. And Jack Morrison was about to find himself at the center of it all, with a very different kind of promise to keep. Part 4, Secrets in the Stars. The Destiny's Edge hummed steadily through the vastness of space, a quiet giant on its mission. Jack Morrison stood at the bridge, his hands resting on the console, staring at the streaks of stars outside the viewport. It had been days since the message from command arrived, the urgency of it gnawing at him. The galaxy was never kind to dreamers, and Jack had learned that lesson well. His career, once driven by hope and optimism, now felt like a series of negotiations, maneuvers, and ever-present risks. But this was different. This was personal. A soft chime broke his reverie. Lieutenant Hayes' voice came through, calm but firm. "Commander, we've received new orders. We are to proceed to Crossroads Station for a priority diplomatic meeting. Code, Alpha." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Priority Alpha, Jack knew that meant top-level clearance, need to know only. These were the kinds of missions that involved the highest stakes. As if on cue, his communicator buzzed again, and this time it was Captain Rodriguez, his mentor. "Jack," Rodriguez said, his tone clipped, "pack your bags, you're being summoned. Don't ask too many questions." Rodriguez, a man who preferred silence over unnecessary words, didn't need to explain further. Jack had learned long ago that when the captain gave orders, it was always for a reason. Crossroads Station, a neutral territory in deep space, where species from across the galaxy came together for delicate, often secretive, talks. It wasn't a place for casual meetings or friendly discussions. It was a place where tension simmered under the surface, where every word could carry the weight of an entire galaxy's future. The only time Jack had been there before was for emergency negotiations, and those had always been fraught with danger. As they neared Crossroads Station, Jack sat in his quarters, staring at the pendant once more. He hadn't thought about Lyra much in recent years, but now, as he prepared to land on the station that had been the site of many of his hardest decisions, he couldn't shake the memories of her. Her wide violet eyes, filled with certainty as she had made her childhood promise. The crystal pendant, still hanging in the pocket of his uniform, felt heavier now. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Commander, we've arrived at Crossroads Station," Lieutenant Hayes reported. Jack nodded, pushing the thoughts of the past aside. Time to focus. There was no room for sentiment in this line of work. He was here for one reason, to ensure peace. He'd learned the hard way that nothing was ever truly as it seemed in the diplomatic world. There were always layers of truth buried beneath the surface. When he stepped off the ship and into the docking bay, the atmosphere was different. The station was silent, its long corridors echoing with the quiet footsteps of those who walked it. This was no bustling hub. It was a place of whispered conversations and high-stakes deals. The kind of place where deals could be made or broken in the blink of an eye. Jack's security team flanked him as they made their way through the labyrinth of hallways. They passed species Jack had only seen in brief flashes in his reports. There were no smiles here, only calculating eyes and faces hardened by years of political maneuvering. He had been here before, but this time, something felt off. The usual tension of diplomatic talks had turned into something colder, darker. Finally, they reached the conference room, a sterile, glass-walled space that overlooked the stars. Inside, sitting at the long table, were several figures dressed in the ornate military uniforms of the Valerian Empire. Jack's pulse quickened. But it wasn't the presence of the Valerians that froze him in his tracks. It was the woman standing at the head of the table. Lyra. It was impossible. Jack blinked twice, convinced his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, she was really there, standing tall and strong, not the innocent child he remembered, but a commanding figure, one who had clearly grown into her royal and military role. Her silver hair, once adorned with delicate ornaments, now fell in a practical braid down her back. Her violet eyes, the same eyes that had once looked up at him with wide wonder, now glinted with sharp intelligence. "Commander Morrison," she said, her voice smooth and confident, "thank you for coming." Jack's heart raced, his thoughts whirling. This was not a coincidence. After all these years, after everything that had happened, she was here, and she was leading this meeting. She had always been more than just the princess. She had been playing a far bigger game, one that Jack had only just begun to understand. "Princess Lyra, I wasn't expecting this," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He had seen many things in his career, but this was something entirely different. "You and I," she said, locking eyes with him, "have a lot to discuss, more than you think." The room seemed to close in around them as Lyra's words sank in. Whatever this meeting was about, whatever the Valerians were planning, it was not going to be a simple diplomatic talk. Jack could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. The past, the present, and the future were all colliding in this moment, and he had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was clear. Lyra had returned, and the promise she made, the one Jack had forgotten, was no longer just a child's fantasy. It was a reality that was about to reshape everything. And as Lyra took a seat, signaling for Jack to do the same, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a story that would change the fate of both their worlds. Part 5: The Weight of a Promise. The Destiny's Edge drifted quietly through space, its engines humming softly as the crew prepared for the next phase of their mission. Jack Morrison sat alone in his quarters, the gentle thrum of the ship the only sound that filled the silence. His mind, however, was far from calm. Since his unexpected reunion with Princess Lyra, everything had shifted. The lines between professional duty and something more personal had blurred, and Jack was struggling to maintain the balance. He looked down at the crystal pendant resting in his hand, its light shifting as it caught the dim glow of his quarters. It had been tucked away for years, a memento from a time he'd long since forgotten. But now, it felt like a link to a past he hadn't fully understood. Lyra's promise, made when she was just a child, had stayed with him in the back of his mind, something he had dismissed as youthful naivete. But after the meeting on Crossroads Station, the reality of that promise hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chime of his communicator. It was Lieutenant Hayes. "Commander, we have a situation. Princess Lyra is requesting to meet with you. She says it's urgent." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Urgent. The word echoed in his mind as he stood up, his hand instinctively going to the pendant once again before slipping it into his pocket. There was no time to dwell on the past. The mission, the galaxy, and the fate of humanity were far too important. He arrived at the conference room to find Lyra waiting. She was no longer the curious child he had once met in the gardens of New Meridian. The woman before him radiated authority and purpose, her violet eyes sharp and calculating. The military commander, the diplomat, the princess. Each role was now seamlessly woven into her being. She had come a long way from the little girl who had pulled at his sleeve, asking about dogs and human emotions. "Commander," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "we need to talk." Jack nodded, taking a seat across from her. The room was quiet, the hum of the ship and the distant stars the only background noise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years between them felt like an endless chasm. The Lyra he had known was gone, replaced by someone who had seen too much, learned too much, and carried the weight of her family's expectations on her shoulders. "I've spent the last 20 years watching everything," Lyra began, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet intensity. "Watching the way humanity has grown, the way we've interacted, the mistakes we've made. And I realized something." Jack raised an eyebrow. He had no idea where this conversation was going, but he had learned long ago to expect the unexpected when it came to Lyra. "I realized that peace," she continued, "isn't something we can take for granted. The galaxy is changing. The Valerian Empire is changing. My brother Emperor Thern has plans and they don't include cooperation with humanity." Jack's pulse quickened. He had known that tensions were rising between their two worlds, but hearing it from Lyra, hearing the weight of her words, made it all the more real. The peaceful alliance they had once dreamed of seemed to be slipping away. "Lyra, I don't understand," Jack said, leaning forward. "What are you saying? What's really happening?" She looked him straight in the eyes, the same violet eyes that had once looked at him with innocent wonder now filled with something much darker. "There's a faction within my empire, one that believes humanity is a threat. They're planning something that will destroy everything we've worked for, and I'm trying to stop it." Jack felt the floor shift beneath him. He had always known that politics were complicated, that alliances could falter, but he never imagined this. The Valerian Empire, once the beacon of hope for peaceful coexistence, was now a powder keg, ready to explode. "But why come to me?" Jack asked. "Why now, after all these years?" Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jack saw a flicker of the girl he had met all those years ago. But it was quickly replaced by the steely resolve of the woman who had grown into something far more formidable. "Because you're the one who always listened," she said quietly. "You're the one who believed that different species could work together. I need you, Jack. I need you to understand that this isn't just politics. This is personal, for both of us." Her words hit him like a wave, but it was the final one that caused the ripple. "This is personal." Jack felt a knot form in his chest. He had always kept his distance, focused on the mission, the greater good. But Lyra had never been just another diplomat. She was the promise of something more, something Jack had buried deep inside himself, only to have it resurface with a force he wasn't ready for. "I don't know if I can help you with this, Lyra," Jack admitted, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm not that man anymore. I've seen too much. I've lost too much." Lyra stood up and walked toward the window, her back to him. "Maybe not," she said, her voice distant. "But I believe you still have the capacity to do what's right. And right now, that means stopping a war before it starts." Jack took a deep breath. He wanted to say no. He wanted to refuse her, to step away from the past and the painful memories it brought with it. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when the galaxy's fate and his own hung in the balance. "You've given me everything I need to understand," Jack said, his voice firm with resolve. "But now we have to act." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to read him, to find some trace of the man who had once listened to her childhood promise. "We will," she said, "together." In that moment, Jack knew that the past wasn't something he could leave behind. It was with him always, and the promise that Lyra had made all those years ago wasn't something to be ignored. It was something that would shape everything that was to come. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but one thing was clear. Jack and Lyra were no longer just two diplomats caught in the tides of intergalactic politics. They were now partners in a fight that could determine the future of both their peoples. And together, they would face whatever came next. Part 6, A Flicker of Betrayal. The stars outside the Destiny's Edge seemed to pulse with an unnatural urgency as the ship traveled through hyperspace. Jack Morrison paced in his quarters, his mind tangled with thoughts of the past and the unsettling present. The mission had taken a sharp turn since his meeting with Princess Lyra. What started as a simple diplomatic mission had evolved into something far darker, something he wasn't entirely sure he was prepared for. For days, Lyra had shared everything she knew about the growing threat within her empire. Her brother, Emperor Thern, had become more isolationist and aggressive. Lyra's warnings were clear. A faction within the Valyrian military had already begun laying the groundwork for a full-scale military strike against humanity. But what disturbed Jack the most wasn't the potential for war. It was the betrayal that lingered in the air, hidden behind the careful facade of diplomacy. Lyra had trusted him with the truth, but in doing so, she had opened up a web of lies, intrigue, and personal conflict. And now, standing at the crossroads of intergalactic peace and war, Jack found himself questioning everything he had ever known about loyalty and trust. "Commander, we've arrived at Crossroads Station," Lieutenant Hayes announced over the intercom, her voice cutting through Jack's turbulent thoughts. He didn't respond immediately. Crossroads Station. A place for diplomacy, yes, but Jack knew better than to trust its neutrality. He had seen what happened when negotiations broke down here before. The tension was always thick, the air heavy with the knowledge that even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. When Jack entered the briefing room aboard the station, he was greeted not just by Lyra but by a new, unexpected figure, Admiral Vex, one of the most respected military commanders in the Valyrian Empire. The man stood at attention, his cold gaze never leaving Jack's face. Beside him were several high-ranking Valyrian officials, including an older woman with piercing eyes who seemed to study Jack as though he were a puzzle to be solved. "I trust you've all had time to review the intelligence we sent," Lyra said, her voice steady, despite the storm swirling in the room. Jack nodded but said nothing, his mind racing. They had spent days going over the Valyrian fleet movements, tracking their every move, gathering intel on their plans. But now that they were here, face to face with the very people he had once hoped to call allies, the weight of betrayal felt heavy on his shoulders. "Lyra," Jack began, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty, "are we sure about this? We've seen the reports, but there's something off about all of this." Lyra's gaze met his, and for the first time in their dealings, he saw something unfamiliar in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Jack didn't miss it. "It's true, Jack," she replied, her voice unshaken. "I've spent years preparing for this. I've watched Thern grow more ruthless with every passing year. He has the support of powerful factions in the military. They've already begun mobilizing. It's only a matter of time before they strike." But even as she spoke, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. Was Lyra truly the innocent diplomat she appeared to be, or had she been playing a deeper game all along? Before he could voice his concerns, a sharp voice interrupted the tension. "Enough of this," Admiral Vex snapped, his voice low but full of authority. "You know the stakes, Lyra. This is more than just a matter of politics. We're talking about the survival of the Valyrian Empire." Jack turned sharply to face the Admiral. His cold eyes and rigid posture made it clear that he was a man who played by his own rules. The words he spoke hung in the air like a challenge, and Jack's instincts kicked in. "There's more going on here than you're telling me," Jack said, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm not a fool. You've been moving resources in ways that don't add up. Why haven't you come to me sooner with this intel? Why now, and why with all of you involved?" Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Jack's. "Because it's too dangerous, Jack," she said softly. "There's a price on my head. If Thayern finds out I've come here, if he learns I'm working with you, everything we've done will fall apart. I'm the one who left the Empire, the one who chose peace. I'm the traitor in their eyes." Her words hit harder than Jack expected. He had always respected Lyra's resolve, her ability to navigate the complexities of diplomacy with grace and intelligence. But this was something else entirely. The weight of betrayal wasn't just about politics, it was personal. "I didn't want you involved in this," Lyra continued, her voice raw now, the veneer of diplomacy slipping. "But now I'm asking for your help because I can't stop it alone. I need you to understand why we can't let Thayern succeed. He's not just a threat to us, he's a threat to humanity." Jack's chest tightened. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. She wasn't just asking for help, she was asking him to cross a line that might make him a traitor to his own people. Before he could respond, the door to the briefing room slid open, and one of the Valerian guards stepped in, a look of urgency on his face. "Commander Morrison, we have a situation," he said, his voice strained. Jack stood up immediately. "What's going on?" "The fleet," the guard said, his voice trembling. "They've arrived. It's worse than we thought. There are ships from Thayern's faction here and they're preparing to strike." Jack's heart sank. The plan had already begun. The quiet hum of the Destiny's Edge seemed distant now, replaced by the heavy silence of impending conflict. Lyra turned to face him, her face a mask of determination. "This is it, Jack. We don't have much time. They're here and we have to act." The weight of her words settled into the pit of Jack's stomach. The battle was no longer distant. It was now, and they were on the brink of a war neither side was truly prepared for. He had no choice but to trust her. But as he followed Lyra to the command center, a dark thought lingered at the edge of his mind. Had he been manipulated all along? The thought twisted in his gut, but there was no time to question it now. The storm was here, and it was going to change everything. Part 7, The Turning Point. The quiet hum of the Destiny's Edge was suddenly filled with a sense of urgency as alarms blared throughout the ship. The familiar calm of space seemed to slip away, replaced by the chaotic pulse of an impending conflict. Jack Morrison stood at the center of the command deck, his mind racing. The situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The faction loyal to Emperor Thayern had made their move, and the galaxy was on the brink of war. "Commander Morrison, we've detected incoming ships," Lieutenant Hayes reported, her voice tight with urgency. "It's happening faster than we thought. The fleet's been deployed." Jack's stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of everything they had worked for, the fragile peace, the quiet diplomacy, the decades of delicate relations, crumbling under the pressure of Thayern's ambition. This wasn't just about military strategy anymore. It was personal. The lives of millions were at stake. But more than that, this was a moment Jack knew he couldn't walk away from. His decisions here would determine the future of not just humanity, but the Valerian Empire as well. "Where are they coming from?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "From the Theta sector. It's a coordinated strike," Hayes replied, her fingers flying over the controls as she processed the incoming data. "But there's something strange. It's not just military ships. There are civilian vessels among them." Jack frowned. Civilian vessels. It didn't make sense. The Valerian Empire had always maintained strict control over its fleet, and yet here they were, using civilian ships to launch a strike. It was as if they were trying to blur the lines between war and peace, hiding their true intentions behind the guise of everyday vessels. He turned toward Lyra, who had been silent beside him, her face pale but determined. She had spent the last few hours briefing him on the military movements, the strategy, the intelligence she had painstakingly gathered. But now, as the weight of the moment pressed down on them both, Jack could see the strain in her eyes. This was more than just a political struggle for her. It was a personal war, a battle to save the people she cared about and the empire she had once called home. "They're coming for Earth," Lyra said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "But it's not just about Earth anymore. Vern wants to make an example of us all. He's willing to burn everything to the ground to maintain his power." Jack looked at her, his mind grappling with the enormity of the situation. The Valyrian Empire was no longer just a political ally. It was a fractured, unstable force, teetering on the edge of civil war. And at the center of it all was Lyra, once the innocent child who had declared her promise, now the woman who had risked everything to stop the destruction of everything she had known. "We can't stop them if we don't act fast," Jack said, his voice firm. "We have to make a stand." Lyra nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "I've already made arrangements. Kira's loyalists are waiting for us. We just need to buy them enough time to mobilize." Jack felt a spark of hope. Kira, Lyra's younger sister, the one who had quietly worked in the shadows to build a faction of loyalists who shared her vision of peace. If Kira could hold her ground, they might just have a chance to turn the tide. But it would be close. Too close. As the enemy fleet continued to close in, Jack's thoughts raced through their options. The Destiny's Edge was not a warship. It was a diplomatic vessel, designed for peace, not battle. They had no real weapons to speak of, only defensive shields and a skeleton crew trained for diplomacy, not combat. "We're going to have to improvise," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Get ready for a fight, Lyra. We're about to turn this ship into a fortress." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile, a look of recognition passing between them. It was the same smile she had worn 20 years ago when she had stood in the garden, declaring her promise to him with the kind of certainty that only a child could have. The same smile that had haunted him all these years. But now, it wasn't a child's dream. It was the face of a warrior, someone who had seen the horrors of war and understood the stakes better than anyone. As the Destiny's Edge prepared to face the incoming attack, the air on the bridge crackled with tension. Jack could hear the distant hum of the engines, the countdown to the impending battle. He had always known that one day, his career would force him to make a choice, one that would define not just his future, but the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. This was that moment. Lyra stepped closer to him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. The gesture was simple, but in that fleeting touch, Jack felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this point. The past, the promise, the friendship that had blossomed in the gardens of New Meridian, all of it had led them here. And now, the only thing that mattered was stopping the war before it started. "Whatever happens next," Lyra said, her voice soft but filled with unspoken emotion, "thank you for standing with me." Jack met her gaze, his heart heavy but resolute. "We're in this together, and I won't let Vern destroy what we've built." As the first wave of enemy ships broke through the distant stars, Jack felt the familiar pull of the past and the present colliding. There was no turning back now. The storm had come, and the only way out was through. The war had begun, and Jack and Lyra were about to fight for their worlds.